Oh my god, I was not ready for this. Not in the slightest. Where do I even start with this review? Well, I guess I should begin by going back to the past. Back in summer of 2021, I decided to check out a Disney Plus animated series called The Owl House after hearing good things about it. For those who aren't familiar, it's about a teenage girl, Luz Noceda, who accidentally finds herself in a place called the Boiling Isles, part of another universe called the Demon Realm, filled with magic and fantasy. From there, she's brought under the care of Ida Clawthorne, a rogue witch. She eventually enrolls in the magic school, meets friends, and gets involved in an overarching plot of political strife, mystical legends, ancient history, and most importantly, bisexuality. Now, if you thought that was a lot to take in, I must have done a good job saying it, because it perfectly encapsulates just how positively insane The Owl House is. It truly is a show you have to experience. If I try to explain the plot with words only, your reaction will simply be,
Jesse, what the fuck are you talking about?
So I can't, and I won't. This video will be scripted as if the audience is already well accustomed to the series. I'll summarize when necessary to make it feel coherent, but fair warning that if you don't know The Owl House at all, you still won't know it well after this video. Again, the only way you can fully understand it is by actually watching and investing yourself in it, and I don't mean that in a snobby, pretentious way. It's just got so many intricacies and moving parts that you really have no other option. Anyway, back at the time I watched The Owl House, only Season 1 was available on Disney Plus in Canada, even though the first half of Season 2 was out by then. I remember going into Season 1 expecting a fun, lighthearted series that was mostly just magic vibes, but I was blown away by just how damn great it ended up being. To be fair, at the beginning it pretty much was exactly how I expected, an enjoyable show of likable characters vibing, but in the latter half of the season, things really started kicking off, and the overarching mystery started becoming more and more prevalent. Furthermore, the characters had great development, and the story had satisfying payoffs, and holy hell did things get emotional at the end. By the end of Season 1, The Owl House had gone from a good show to a fantastic one, and so I was left wondering, could it possibly get better from there? Well, yes. When I got around to watching Season 2, 18 episodes were already out, and I binged them in a matter of days. Over the course of the next few weeks, I waited patiently for the last 3 episodes, and by the end of May, I had completed the entire second season. So what did I think? Holy mother of God! I am aghast at what I just watched. How the hell is this show real? How is it this awesome? Honestly, it's going to be hard to put this into words because I can't stress enough how much The Owl House Season 2 exceeded my expectations. This time, I went in prepared for greatness. I was ready for a masterpiece, but this was even better. And although it's hard for me to do it justice with words, I'll try. From its story to its characters to its mystery to its creativity, there is just nothing not to love here. I really mean that. But before we get started, obviously there will be spoilers. You have been warned, turn back now. Still there? Okay, good. Let's talk about the story first, because good God is it captivating. The greater plot in Season 1, although interesting, was only really being teased. Most of the time, it was taking a backseat to character interactions and fun side adventures, which I think was fine for the first season. In Season 2, things are very, very different, and the episodes are almost completely devoid of filler, as pretty much all the runtime contributes to building up the mystery or furthering the arcs in some way. That's not to say side stories and subplots don't still happen, but unlike with the previous season, all of them exist in service of the main narrative. There's a feeling of intensity in these newer episodes that was absent from most of the older ones. I constantly found myself on the edge of my seat because I could tell everything was leading up to a climax. I could see the mysterious puzzle pieces fit into place one by one as I continued watching. My mind was constantly in overdrive, trying to figure out what was going on at every possible moment, because I knew I wasn't watching a slice of life show anymore. In this season, everything matters. No matter how entertaining, how heartwarming, how emotional it gets, you always have to be taking notes, because those will absolutely come in handy when you finally get to the crescendo of all that sweet, sweet build-up. And the culmination of all that build-up in the season finale, King's Tide? To say the least, it was deeply satisfying, although slightly rushed at the end, through no fault of the show itself and rather through the fault of Disney cutting it short. Either way, the rest of the season did a fantastic job building up to that conclusion. The tension amping up in my mind, that, my 20 active viewers, is my favorite experience when consuming media of all time. It's rare that media ever makes me feel this way. The last time anything did was when I watched Gravity Falls, and even then the experience was slightly hindered by the fact that by then the show had been over for 5 years and I basically already knew what happened. As much as I enjoy stuff like the MCU, which is more of a guilty pleasure at this point considering how terribly written it usually is, I have never, ever managed to get invested in anything like that the same way I have with The Owl House. I could just go on and on about how well thought out the show is, but instead of droning on, I'm going to support my argument with an example. Spoiler warning yet again, in Season 2, Episode 12, Elsewhere and Elsewhen, they literally introduce time travel, and somehow it works and doesn't break the story at all. In fact, it solves one of the few plot holes that previously existed in the show up until that point. Yeah, I'm serious. For For some context, at this point, Luz is trying to build a portal back home to the human realm by following the instructions laid about by Philip Woodbine, a colonial-era explorer who found himself trapped on the Boiling Isles just like her. She decides she wants to use time travel magic to go back in time and speak to Philip herself so she can understand how to use the portal. There's just one small setback. There's no such thing as time travel magic, and time travel can only be done under very specific circumstances at very specific locations during very specific times. I won't get into the intricacies of it here, but what you need to know is that Luz and Lilith, Ida's sister, time travel backwards a few centuries to meet Philip. After they meet Philip, Luz gets to know him a little and shows him some of the magic glyphs she discovered, such as the light glyph. These were glyphs Philip wasn't aware of before and wouldn't have discovered without the help of time-traveling Luz. Keep that in mind. Later on in the episode, Luz and Lilith get completely and utterly bamboozled as Philip turns out to be cringe rather than based and betrays them, trying to sacrifice them for his plans. Admittedly, trusting a 1600s-era colonial pilgrim was not the best idea. Thankfully, they both managed to escape and return to the present. There's just one small issue though. Now Philip has knowledge he wouldn't have had if not for the time traveling, and he uses it to further his plans. The audience learns at the end of this episode that, surprise surprise, Philip is the same person as Emperor Belos, the main villain of the show in the present day. Around this time in the past, he made a deal with a godlike being named the Collector to one day achieve his goals, and became ageless, presumably through consuming the magic within Palisman. The point is, Philip is Belos. Episode 12 plays with what's known as a stable time loop, a concept in which a time traveler goes to the past and ends up altering the timeline to lead to the same present conditions which caused the time traveler to go back into the past in the first place. This is cool because it doesn't break the timeline at all. The implication in the Owl House's case is that time is circular, and these time travel shenanigans were always meant to happen from the beginning. In Season 1, Belos is responsible for destroying Luz's original portal back home, which is what prompts her to begin her research on Philip Woodbine and eventually time travel to talk to him. By talking to Philip in the past and showing him the glyph she discovered in the present, Luz has now provided Philip the knowledge he needs to carry out his plan and eventually become Belos, only to ensure the destruction of Luz's portal in the present and cause the cycle to repeat endlessly. And yes, I know Luz was technically the one who destroyed her own portal in the fight scene at the end of Season 1, but I'm pinning the responsibility for that on Belos, because he was the one who took the portal for his evil plans and drove Luz to do that. Now, the use of the stable time loop trope would already be great enough, as after Luz discovers this in episode 16, Hollow Mind, she has to deal with the responsibility of having partially caused Belos' rise in the first place, and that is something she struggles with in the following episodes. But it doesn't end there. One of the biggest supposed plot holes in the entire series started with Season 2. You see, in Season 1, as I mentioned earlier, Luz directly fought against Belos in order to rescue Ida, and you'd think Belos would have had her arrested in the aftermath of this finale, seeing as he remained in power going into the second season. For whatever reason though, Belos never does this. He lets Luz roam free, even though he and his entire army know exactly where she and Ida live. Why would such a methodical, cunning character like Belos make such a baffling decision? It did seem to me like a glaring hole in the story for a while, but episodes 12 and 16 completely patch it with the time travel plot I just spoke about. There's now a perfectly reasonable explanation. Present-day Belos knows he has to leave Luz alone until she can get to the point where she time travels back to the past and gives his past self the knowledge he needs to achieve his current position in the future. If he were to arrest Luz before she decided to time travel, and as a result of this she never ended up doing so, it would alter history and ruin Belos' plan. So basically, that's why Belos let Luz continue to live freely for most of the second season. In episode 16, he learns that present Luz has already gone to the past and met him there just as he remembers from centuries ago, and what happens at the end of episode 17, which takes place right after 16, Belos' army finally surrounds Luz's house. The time loop has been fulfilled, and Belos no longer has to shy away from capturing her or her friends. Honestly, this might be the best usage of time travel as a narrative device I've ever seen. Not only does it function and not break the laws of existence itself, it also serves to enhance the story and explain away previous plot holes. It just goes to show how tightly written the second season is, and it's obvious how much passion and care went into the script. Genuinely amazing stuff, but with that being said, I have little left to say about the story. It's captivating, it's engaging, it's gripping, and the writers never waste time to veer off track. If there's one single criticism I can levy at this season, it would be that again, sometimes it feels a little rushed and cramped with all the insane lore and storytelling. As fans of the series know, last year Disney announced the third season would essentially be shafted and the crew was forced to limit it to only 3 lengthened specials, with the runtime amounting to only 6 regular episodes. I get the impression that when making season 2, the crew probably had a suspicion the executives were going to pull something like this, and decided to condense the story significantly as a result. In any case, it's still amazing though, and I could tell the writers were doing the best they could given the circumstances. Now, let's get into the characters, both old and new. The returning characters from Season 1 are just as lovable as always, but are now a lot more fleshed out than before. We can start by analyzing the protagonist herself, Luz. Now, I think she was already a great protagonist in Season 1 by virtue of enjoyability and relatability, but for the most part, she seemed like a happy-go-lucky teenager who still hadn't faced the reality of being trapped in another universe by that point. This seemed to be one of the main issues people had with her character back then, but man did the show completely fix that. In Season 2, Luz's cheerful facade starts to break down. She constantly becomes nervous and emotional as she thinks more and more about being torn away from home. You can tell the situation is starting to actually get to her, and she isn't as carefree as she used to be. This is some damn good development, and it all culminates in Season 2, Episode 10, Yesterday's Lie, wherein, through interdimensional shenanigans I won't explain here, Luz finally contacts her mother for a brief period of time. This episode is extremely emotional, especially at the end when Luz is pulled back into the Boiling Isles and has to say goodbye to her mother again. I'd go more in depth here, but this is the sort of thing you just have to watch for yourself to really experience it. There's also another interesting facet of Luz's character in Season 2 that, in retrospect, always existed even back in Season 1, but was a lot more subtle in the beginning, and that would be her guilt complex and her unhealthy obsession with putting others' needs before her own. Now, Bunny Skies has a great video about this that goes in depth about it, and I'll link it in the description, but I'm just going to summarize it here. Luz is a flawed protagonist. She's naive, impulsive, reckless, and often makes mistakes of various severity, which she does and can atone for. But one thing she isn't is selfish. Very rarely are any of her actions driven by motivations to do with her own aspirations, and even when they are, those aspirations are inextricably linked to the happiness and well-being of other characters. Luz consistently sacrifices her own mental and physical health for the sake of others, like when she throws herself into danger and challenges Belos twice in both season finales, the first time so she can rescue Ida, and the second time so she can stop the evil plan and protect her friends. She even switches places with Hunter, a character I'll get to later, so he doesn't have to face Belos again after the way he psychologically abused and manipulated him. These are two of many examples, and if you're familiar with the events of the show, you'll probably realize Luz does this sort of thing compulsively. In addition, she also pins an absurd amount of blame on herself for her mistakes, even when a lot of them were caused by a lack of knowledge, which could never be considered her fault. Perhaps the greatest example of this would be the time travel situation I mentioned earlier, where Luz unintentionally ended up helping Belos, or should I say Philip, achieve his plans. This is something she believes she's entirely at fault for, and while yes, her showing him the light glyph in the past did speed up his plan significantly and bring him to the point he's at in the present day, Luz did not know he would become Belos, and therefore shouldn't be held responsible for what he did with the knowledge she gave him. That logic seems sound to you and I, but she cuts herself no slack and lets her guilt drive her actions. Again, she blames herself for the misfortune of others compulsively throughout the series, especially this season, and it's obvious this is a serious issue for her and her mental health. I can only imagine that it will be even worse in the aftermath of Season 2 as, major spoilers, although she has foiled Belos' plans, she's now been trapped out of the demon realm while the now freed Collector uses the entire Boiling Isles as a set for their games. Even though some of her friends came with her, she doesn't know if any of the characters she's unable to reach now, including Ida and King, are safe. In a way, this show almost feels like a character study as far as Luz is concerned, as we get to see her descent from a happy-go-lucky optimist into an overly stressed, obsessively self-sacrificial shell of her former self. Needless to say, she needs some therapy as soon as possible. King would be another example of a character who has been strongly enhanced by Season 2. In Season 1, I absolutely adored him, but he was more or less a comic relief character with the occasional wholesome friendship moment, with witty writing and hilarious delivery from Alex Hirsch being the highlight and cementing the little guy as one of my favorites. There were vague hints suggesting there was more to King's past than what was perceived on the surface, but those were just hints. In Season 2, the mysteries surrounding King are fully in the spotlight, and his journey of discovering his past and the secrets of his family is an active part of the plot. Not only do I love the little guy, I'm now invested in his arc, and that's awesome. There's also a lot of newfound maturity King develops in this season, as opposed to the last one, where he primarily came off as childish and hungry for glory and adoration, which was funny but definitely not any indication of a developed, complex character. In Season 2, as King learns more about his past and his overall importance to the Boiling Isles as, spoiler alert, the young son of the Titan whose remains the entire civilization was built upon, the reality of what that means dawns on him, and he comes to realize maybe he doesn't want such a heavy responsibility on his shoulders at all. As he grows closer to Luz and Ida over the course of the series, he learns that being supported and feared by an army of minions isn't important, but genuine friendship is, and he comes to embrace that truth in a very natural, satisfying manner, while still continuing to be funny and endearing the whole way through. Moving on, we have Amity. If you watched my last video, you'll remember I had a whole section dedicated to talking about her, and I praised her as being the best written character of the show. I believe that's still true, but honestly it is hard to tell since the rest of the main cast has been elevated so much by now that the greatness is all just blending together in my head and the best character is near indiscernible. That being said, Amity is still fantastic this season, and her arc feels like a natural progression from season 1, with her finally gaining the strength to put her friends, and of course her girlfriend Luz, above the restriction and control from her family. And yes, I did say girlfriend. I'm sure everyone and their grandmother knows this by now, but Luz and Amity really did end up getting together in this season, which was a joy to see happen after the build-up in season 1. They do not shy away from this at all. Not only do they officially begin dating midway through the season to maximize the amount of time they're together on screen, the way their relationship progresses feels very, very real. Just like in season 1, it doesn't come off as fake or forced in any regard, which is indicative of just how much the crew really cares about representing queer characters, queer relationships, and queerness in general in a positive, normalized sense. Lumity remains a wholesome pairing throughout the second season and continues to bring me sweet serotonin by virtue of its sheer existence. I genuinely would call this my favorite ship of all time at this point. It's just that good. Do I have anyone left to talk about? Oh yeah, of course, I can't forget about Ida, who also has a compelling arc in this season about learning to control her curse and become one with it. Neat stuff, it's definitely a good direction to take her character after season 1, and we also get to see more of her past and more of her childhood friends and family. We meet Ida's mom, who starts off as, I kid you not, a parody of an aggressively anti-vax parent who puts all their trust in weird pseudoscience, although she does learn she's being scammed at the end and comes to her senses. There's also her dad, who isn't really that important, but he does serve as a foil for Ida because she accidentally hurt him when she was in her cursed state and still won't forgive herself for it, even though he forgives her. And then of course, there's Rain Whispers, her casually non-binary ex, and they're interesting too. I honestly find it so cool how LGBTQ+ concepts seem to be completely normalized in the Boiling Isles. Nobody ever raises an eyebrow at Lumity, and people always seem to respect Rain's identity. I'm bisexual just like Luz, and I understand the importance of stories that depict queer characters dealing with homophobia, discrimination, and injustice, but I also like representation in the way the Owl House does it, where queer identity is shown as if it's just a casual, regular thing. It's a great way of tackling stigmas and prejudice, simple as that. Anyway, speaking of new characters introduced in this season, there's Hunter, aka the Golden Guard. Now I gotta say, my boy is a pretty good addition to the cast. He starts off as Belos' right-hand man, and as far as he knows, his nephew as well. Belos is a clinical manipulator, and has for years raised Hunter to be his obedient servant by being heavily critical of him, but just kind enough to keep him from going away. We see him speak like this, and it's frankly quite terrifying. However, Hunter gradually learns over the course of the season that Belos is actually kinda cringe, and that forces upon him a serious emotional crisis. It all culminates in episode 16, Hollow Mind. Hunter finally gets the full realization that Belos is a horrible person in this episode, and all his doubts come true, and he just completely breaks down at the end. It's emotional, and his crisis really makes me care for him. On the flip side, as the season goes on, he also learns to be more open to new people like Luz and Willow, and escape the tunnel vision Belos set up for him, which keeps him just stable enough to keep going and leads to an interesting dichotomy with his psyche. I also mentioned Amity's family a while ago, because in this season, her parents, Odalia and Alador, are properly introduced after being teased in season 1. Her mother, Odalia, is very much an abusive parent who makes Amity miserable by placing absurd expectations on her and forcing her to participate in her business, Blight Industries. She's a clear-cut antagonist and someone Amity learns to stand up to as she goes through her arc, but more interesting is her father, Alador, who's not at all abusive himself, but certainly an enabler of Odalia's action for the majority of the season. It's pretty obvious that while he isn't awful, he isn't exactly a good dad either, often too busy working to spend time with his children and coming across as neglectful. It's pretty easy not to like him, but as time goes on, context is learned as to why he is that way. Odalia is more or less using him for her business just like Amity and overworking him to the point where he's essentially forced to choose his job over his family. He doesn't like it either, and he wants to change for the better, which he begins doing later on in the season. It's not like he's automatically worthy of forgiveness, but he is improving, and that's a lot more realistic. Eventually, in the penultimate episode, Clouds on the Horizon, my personal favorite, he even stands up to Odalia, who's loyal to Emperor Belos, and sides with Amity and the Rebels, which is great to see. There's definitely a lot more that can be discussed with the characters, and if I really wanted to, I could ramble on for hours, but with that said, I think I'm going to move on to other aspects like the world building and the animation. The world building is still great and builds upon that of the first season substantially, and the especially cool thing about that is how every significant thing we learn about the world in this season is directly linked to the main plot, as I said earlier. The Owl House does an excellent job at developing its world and immersing its audience in it. There's so many new cool additions to the setting and the lore, like the Coven Heads, the Titan Trappers, the Collector, Latissa, the previous Golden Guards before Hunter, sports like Flyer Derby and the Bonesboro Brawl, cultural practices and traditions on the Boiling Isles, the Philip Woodabane backstory, all sorts of stuff. It's fantastic. As for the the animation, it's an improvement from the first season as well, with even more fluid fight scenes and awesome moments. Again, just as I said in the video on season 1, I love the art style of the show, and the character designs continue to be great as well. So is the music too, which really fits with the style just like the music of the first season. Of course, there's also background details that tease some of the mysteries still yet to be concluded, especially in episode 16. The murals in this episode seem to depict a whole other story on their own, which I think is so cool. Once more, I have to state just how much care is put into the Owl House and its lore. Every little detail is a joy to spot and a joy to theorize about. It's just so fun. Honestly, I could talk so much about this show. There's so much to praise and so much to gush about to the point where I could make this video hours long if I chose to. I could describe everything about the second season of The Owl House piece by piece had I the audacity. But I'm not going to do that because it's much more satisfying to watch it yourself and hear it all from me. Suffice it to say, this is a masterpiece of a series. It was already one of my faves back in season 1, but now I can confidently say it's not just my favorite animated series, but my favorite show ever, and my favorite thing to come out of Disney. I genuinely cannot remember the last time I was this in love with any piece of media, plain and simple. Season 2 completely exceeded my already high expectations, and I can't wait for the grand finale. The wait will be antagonizing, but I'm hyped to see where this story ends once and for all. As for you, dear viewer, thanks for watching and listening to me talk about a show I'm so passionate about. I may actually make more videos on this series after this point, touching more on specific topics. Let me know if that's something you'd be interested in. For now, however, I'll head out and see you next time. Have a good day, and goodbye!